Welcome to the complete online dressage course by howtodressage.com. In this presentation, we're going to be focusing on contact within the scales of training. So, in this presentation, we're going to look at what is a correct contact. We're going to also have a look at what makes an incorrect contact. We're going to look at indicators of a good contact and how to establish a good contact. So as a quick recap, here is your dressage scales of training pyramid. Now, contact is the third training scale, and it's dependent on the previous scales of relaxation, rhythm, and suppleness being relatively well developed. Now, none of these scales can be addressed in isolation to the others. They're all interlinked to some degree. However, there's no doubt that focusing on contact can only be effective once the horse has relaxation, rhythm, and suppleness in his body to be able to maintain a steady contact. So, assuming that you've covered the first three presentations where we covered these three aspects, let's now dive into this one. So, what is contact? Well, contact is a very vast subject because it varies from horse to horse. Not only that, it's different at different training levels, even with the same horse. And it will also change in different movements, such as transitions and half halts, where it might be momentarily firmer. In essence, you will never come to the end of learning about contact. It will be something that you're always working on with your horse and always looking to develop it. So let's have a look at how the FEI define contact. And the FEI is the international governing body for equestrian sport. So they say that contact is the soft, steady connection between the rider's hand and the horse's mouth, and that the horse should go rhythmically forward from the rider's driving aids and seek contact with the rider's hand, thus going into the contact. Now, the most important part of this definition is that the horse seeks the contact and the rider provides the contact. In other words, the rider is not imposing a contact on the horse. The contact is coming from the horse seeking contact with the rider's hands. Now, if we attempt to impose a contact on the horse, we usually get something that looks like this. So what we try to do is we try to place the horse's head into an outline, and this causes the horse's head to come behind the vertical and for him to come into this roll curve positioning. So rather than his poll being the highest point, this part becomes the highest point of his neck. So yes, the horse has dropped his head, but it will probably end up hollowing his back as well and trailing his hind legs out behind. Now, this end result is an unbalanced horse that will either lean on your hands for balance rather than taking the weight onto his hind legs, or he will, as seen in this picture, drop behind the vertical in an attempt to avoid working into an unpleasant and hard contact. Now, if we look at this green image of this person, imagine that being you. So your chin is forced onto your chest, your back is arched, and your knees are out from underneath your legs. Your legs are trailing out behind. Now imagine that you have a weight on your back. You can imagine how painful that could be, especially when you're asked to move and run around in this position. Now, this is caused from riding from the rein and trying to use only the reins to establish a contact and an outline. Now, there is nothing good about this. The untrained eye may think that it looks pretty, when in actual fact, it's painful. This is an incorrect contact, and it will be heavily penalised in the dressage arena. Now let's look at another example of an incorrect contact. And this is when people work the horse on a loose rein with the contact abandoned, the horse on the forehand with little impulsion. Now note that this says loose rein, not a long rein. A long rein can still be working correctly. The horse can still be going into the contact. You do have some connection still with the horse. but with a loose rein, the contact is abandoned altogether. Now, in this scenario, the rider may think that they have a light contact, when in fact they have no contact at all. All the contact is inconsistent. So it's there, it's not there, etc. Now, in order to have a good elastic contact, the contact must be soft, but also firm and constant. Now, it does take a lot of time to develop a good contact, but it will be worth it in the end. So now let's quickly run through a list of indicators of a good contact. So when you are riding your horse in the arena, how do you know if you have got a good connection with him? Well, here are a few things that you should be looking out for. So firstly, the contact should be firm but light. Secondly, the horse should step forward into the contact, working through a supple poll. Now, one of the most important points is that the horse should work over a raised back, swinging along to allow the energy from the hindquarters to be transmitted into the bridle. This is what makes the contact possible, and we'll look at this circle of energy further on in this presentation. Now, the horse should accept this elastic contact. He should quietly chew the bit without the tongue being visible. Now, as we talked about earlier in a previous presentation, quietly chewing the bit is desirable, but don't confuse it with a horse frantically gnawing at the bit or snatching at the reins. Those are signs of tension, but quietly chewing the bit is something to look out for. Next, the poll should be the highest point in a correct classical contact. The nose should be slightly in front of the vertical or on the vertical in higher degrees of collection, and in the medium and the extended paces, the horse should visibly lengthen the entire frame, including the neck. Now, a test of a correct contact is that when you yield the rein forward for a step or two, so as in the give and retake, the horse's outline is maintained without any change. Now, if you're not quite sure what a give and retake is, then don't worry, we are going to do a separate presentation on it later on in this course. But moving on to just looking on to contact, another test of contact is that the horse seeks to take the contact forward and down when the rein is lengthened. So there are a few things to look out for. If you can achieve those, then you probably have a good contact with your horse. Now, you remember this picture from earlier. Now let's move on to look at a similar picture, but with a horse that's working in a more correct contact. So here is a better one. Now in this image, the horse's back is raised. His hind legs are stepping underneath him, and he is stretching forwards towards the contact. So as you can see, the horse's head is not held in place with the reins, which is one of the biggest misconceptions when it comes to the contact and the outline. Instead, it's the energy over the horse's back, so him stretching into the contact, that gives the horse's head and neck the correct position and creates a correct contact. Now, another thing to note is that this image is showing quite an advanced and collected outline, and novice horses and those right at the beginning of their training might not have the strength and the relative engagement in order to keep their hind legs stepping under, to keep their back raised and working through to the contact, and to stay connected like this for long periods. Now, they may briefly come off the contact and lose the connection, possibly coming a bit too high or a bit too low, but they'll quickly find the aids again and reconnect. And with intelligent and sympathetic riding, this is okay, and it's to be expected with young and novice horses. So in the early days, it's best to keep the training sessions short to prevent muscle soreness and fatigue. And although you won't be able to achieve this exact outline at the beginning of your horse's training, the principles are still the same. Instead, your horse's frame will just be longer and lower. But the most important thing you need to get from this image is that the horse is stretching to the contact. The horse's back is raised and the hind legs are stepping forward and underneath the horse's body. So to make all those things possible, it comes down to a circle of energy. Now, when we think of contact, we do sometimes think of just what happens between the horse's mouth and the rider's hands. But there is so much more to contact than that. Contact is part of this circle of energy that should flow. So it should start from the horse's active hind legs. This is a good rhythm. Once you get this good rhythm, energy can flow over the horse's back. If you watched the suppleness video, you'll know that this is longitudinal suppleness. This energy then arrives in the horse's mouth. It travels along the reins to the rider's hands, and this is where it can be modified to create movements such as transitions, lengthened strides, half halts, etc. It then goes through the rider's supple body, through the seat, back down to the legs, into the driving aids of the rider, and then back to create more activity from the hind legs, and then the energy circle goes again around and around. Now, to create this energy circle, both the horse's body and the rider's body is involved. And this outline and the contact with the rider's hands comes from this impulsion and the horse's willingness to work over his back. Now, the contact that you feel in your hand should never exceed the amount of energy that is being generated by the horse's hind legs. In other words, your hand should only receive what your legs put into it. Now, this type of contact should create a harmonious connection with the horse. And if we have done our jobs correctly, then the horse should be happy to have this connection with us. So now let's talk about how we go about establishing this connection. How do we establish a correct contact? So first, let's talk about holding the reins. So your thumb should lie flat on top of the rein, and your wrist should be upright with your knuckles lined up. And your fingers should be lightly closed around the rein with your hands carried as a pair and kept still. Now, the rein length is held by pressing your thumb onto the rein where it passes over your index finger. So if you're one of these where your reins tends to get too long, it's this pressure here that should be controlling the length of your reins. Now, the rest of your fingers, these are what are creating the soft contact and the soft movements that produce subtle half halts and communications down the rein to your horse. Now, if you are trying to hold the length of the rein with your fingers, you won't achieve a subtle but steady contact. Your fingers should hold the rein softly at the base without tugging or setting against the horse's mouth. And then to gauge the amount of grip you should have, imagine that you are holding a bird in your hand, so it needs to be strong enough that you're not going to let it escape, but not so strong enough that you'll crush it and kill it. Now, we talk more about holding the reins and the rein length in the rider module of this course. So if you want to check that out, just head over to course.howtodressage.com. Now, once we have the actual hands on the reins correctly and doing the right things, we also need a straight and unbroken line from our elbow along our forearm through a soft wrist to the horse's mouth. Now, a good practice here is to consider that the rein contact starts at the horse's mouth and then terminates at the rider's elbow. And your hand is a modifier en route. So it's those fingers on the reins that are creating the communication with the horse. Now, with this concept, pulling back on the reins becomes a thing of the past, because the elbows should never move behind the rider's body. And as a result, the energy in that system that we talked about earlier is never blocked by a rein contact. The hands should never pull back. You should always feel as though you are pushing the horse to the contact. Now, as mentioned, that rein length is held by that thumb on top of that finger, and the knuckles that are lined up holding the rest of the rein is what you use to communicate with the horse. That is what helps you create your half halt and your subtle communications. So now we know how to hold the reins correctly. Let's talk about feeling the contact. Because in order for the contact to be light, you must develop supple feeling hands. Because the horse will only seek a contact with the hand if that contact is elastic and comfortable, and he can trust that his mouth won't be bruised. So, your hands, wrists, elbows and shoulders should all breathe with the horse's movements. He is a live animal. But at the same time, you should make sure that your contact is steady, light and even into both reins. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the correct contact has no visible looping. It's not a loose rein. Yes, you can ride your horse on a long rein, but this should not be confused with a loose rein. And the most important thing I can say about contact is don't fiddle. Fiddling with the reins to try to get your horse on a contact or in an outline is very similar to that first picture where the horse was in pain in that roll curve positioning. That is what will happen. The horse won't work into the contact. Instead, he will more than likely try to duck behind the contact. So that contact must be steady, light and even. It must breathe with the horse's movement, and the horse must be able to work into it, knowing that it will be elastic and comfortable for him. So finally, let's talk about how you go connecting with your horse and creating this contact from scratch. So here are a few steps. So you're going to begin by riding your horse on a loose rein in walk. Now, as mentioned, this is a loose rein. You've got no contact with the horse. He's just walking freely forwards. Now, you're going to keep your elbows and wrists soft, your legs on, and then you're gradually going to begin to pick up the reins for a contact. Now, keep riding the horse forward, keep shortening the reins, but stop when you can feel the horse is comfortably reaching into his bridle. But don't try to force the horse onto the bit. You should just feel him at the end of the reins. Now, if you feel your horse draw back from your hand, he might come behind the vertical, he may drop behind the contact altogether, or he may drop his poll too far. If any of those things happen, then allow more rein, ride forwards and begin again. Now, if your horse has not had a pleasant experience with contact in the past, possibly you're retraining him, then it may take him a little while to develop the confidence that he needs to stretch into the contact. But just be patient and remember to keep riding from the back to the front. Essentially, forget about the outline, just concentrate on having your horse in front of your leg, working forwards over a supple back, that longitudinal suppleness that we talked about in a previous presentation, and make sure that he's swinging along in a good rhythm without tension or resistance. Eventually, he will start to connect to the bit. But never feel as though you are pulling back or taking the contact from him. Always feel as though your hands are pushing the horse to the contact rather than imposing the contact on him. Now, as we saw in the diagrams earlier, if you just try and pick up the reins, fiddle with them a bit and try and bring the horse's head into an outline, an incorrect outline, then not only will your horse be very unhappy and in pain, you will struggle to move up the dressage levels because the horse will be working in a posture that isn't functional. His back will be hollow and his hind legs will be trailing out behind him. Contact does not come from the hands. Contact comes from the legs and the energy flowing over the horse's back. So to summarise this presentation, contact is the third building block in the scales of training and is dependent on the previous scales of rhythm, relaxation and suppleness being relatively well developed, although all the scales are interlinked. Now, the contact will vary from horse to horse. It will also change during different movements and at different training levels with the same horse. But remember that it is the horse that seeks the contact and the rider provides the contact. The rider does not impose a contact on the horse. And the most important thing to remember when it comes to developing a good contact is to simply ride your horse forwards from back to front. Contact is the result of correct training. Yes, developing a good elastic contact does take time and patience, but it will be worth the effort in the end. Now, this presentation was brought to you by How to Dressage. If you would like to continue with this course, please visit course.howtodressage.com. Thank you very much for watching.